Good morning, everyone. My name is Lindsay Newton. I'm the Director of Community Engagement here at the Missouri Historical Society, and I want to thank you today for joining us for our virtual program, Our River Conversation, Protecting the River. This morning's program is inspired by one of our special exhibits right now, the Mighty Mississippi, which is presented by Bank of America. So I want to send a huge thank you out to Bank of America for supporting us, and also a heartfelt thank you to JSM Charitable Trust, who are the education sponsor for this exhibit, as well as Ward and Carol Klein, who have sponsored the Our River series of programs. Thank you to all. And we also want to acknowledge our members today. I know many of you watching are members of MHS, and your support makes so much of our work possible. And last but certainly not least, we appreciate the support from the Zoo Museum Tax District. We sincerely thank you for your tax contributions. Safety is, of course, a top priority. That is why we are coming to you virtually today, as we have been for several months now. And we will continue to do virtual programs. But I will just mention that the museum is open, the Missouri History Museum in Forest Park, as well as our Soldiers Memorial Building downtown. And if you feel safe and would like to visit, we would love to have you come and get to see the Mighty Mississippi exhibit in person. There are a lot of safety precautions in place, and there are online reservations. So you can pick up free tickets in advance by visiting our website. And then I will quickly just mention how today's program will work. This will be a roughly 30-minute presentation, followed by 10 to 15 minutes for questions and answers. And you can submit questions through the Q&A button in your toolbar. Please know that we will do our best, but we might not have time to get to all of your questions. Also, today's program is being recorded. If you would like to see it again, or maybe share it with family and friends who aren't able to be here to watch today, within a few days, it will go on our YouTube channel so that you can view it at any time. And also all of our past programs are on the YouTube channel, so I'd encourage you to check that out if you have a chance. Today is actually the fourth installment in a series of Our River Conversations, so there are a lot of great things to watch if you have a moment to go to YouTube. And lastly, your feedback is always important to us. Shortly, a new tab in your browser will open. It's a Kobo Toolbox tab, and it just has a few questions asking for your feedback about your experience with our virtual program. If you would be able to answer those questions, it would really help us plan for the future when you leave the session. Thank you. And at this time, it is my pleasure to introduce you to our wonderful speakers today. First, Elizabeth Huberts is the director of the Interdisciplinary Environmental Clinic and an associate professor of practice at Washington University. As director of the clinic, she supervises law and undergraduate students as they handle environmental cases in work, practically in service. Oh, I'm sorry. She handles environmental cases in Missouri and Illinois, learning to practice law and learning how to put their studies to work practically in service to the environment. So Liz does a lot with the students who will be working with the laws in the future. And she also teaches law students and undergraduates the basis of environmental law. Also, we have Eric Freifogel joining us. He is a longtime scholar of natural resources and property law, author of many books and published writings on wildlife law, water law, and private property. He's paid particular attention in his work to the larger context of land and water conservation, probing the cultural roots of our misuses of nature and engaging the fundamental philosophic questions of how we ought to live in and with natural systems. So thank you both for being here today. And with that, Elizabeth, I'm going to hand it off to you to get us started.
All right, thank you. Here to talk about the Mississippi River and law. So there are a lot of laws that have to do with the Mississippi River. It's a big place. Activities on the river have their own set of laws. Activities about what you can do with the water, how much it should flow where, who gets to use it and how they get to use it. Laws about how you can navigate it. What happens if you're working on the river and you get hurt has its own special set of laws. What you can do with your property that butts up against the river. And in their own ways, they all have something to do with protection of the river, sometimes more with protection of how people want to use the river than the river itself. But I'm going to talk about a small subset of this big universe of laws, the laws that are designed specifically for environmental protection. So what these laws do is protect the quality of the water in the river and the aquatic creatures that live in the water of the river. So if you can go to the first slide. And as long as people have been living by the Mississippi River, they've been putting things into the Mississippi River that they don't want anymore. So it's a big river, and you can put your garbage, your waste into the river. It will dilute, so the river doesn't necessarily look terrible if you're just putting something small in. And then it goes downstream and it's no longer your problem. So Mississippi has been the target of pollution for a long time, but it took the industrial era to really scale up and make it a big problem. So when you're talking about clean water quality, the biggest law is the Clean Water Act. This is a federal law passed by Congress in 1972, and it was originally vetoed by President Nixon, but Congress overrode the veto. And it's always been hard for me to imagine the similar thing happening in today's Congress, but back then they had the votes to be able to do it. Clean Water Act was passed, and it has an origin story. That's why the photo is up. That's a picture of a fire on the Cuyahoga River. So the Cuyahoga flows through downtown Cleveland, and it caught fire repeatedly in the 50s and 60s, 13 times. And technically, when they say the river is on fire, they don't really mean the river. It's the layer of chemicals that kind of forms a sheen on top of the river. That's flammable, that catches fire and makes the pictures like you see here, where they're having to put out an actual fire on the river. So most people in 1969, when one of the latest ones occurred, could agree that rivers should not be burning. And that's what eventually led to the Clean Water Act. Next slide, please. So at the time, before the Clean Water Act, states were the ones that primarily had control of all of the water that was within their borders, and with a big river like Mississippi that ran alongside their borders. So you can see some of the problems that are going to develop if you've got each state doing its own thing. So in the case of the main stem of the Mississippi, there are 10 states. Each of them got to do what they wanted to do with their waters, including not make any rules about pollution if that's what they thought was best. And if you add in the Mississippi tributaries, the Ohio River and the Missouri River, there are even more states, each doing its own thing. And because of the nature of flowing water, a state doesn't have a strong incentive to place limits on what's happening. So in other words, because you can put something in the water in Minnesota, a pollutant in the water, it goes downstream. You don't have to see it again. People downstream, maybe in Louisiana or maybe just in Illinois and Iowa, do, but then it goes past them. So there's less of an incentive for a state, which is mainly concerned with its own borders, to really look at the big picture of the Mississippi River. And that's what was happening. So the idea was, well, we need a federal law. The federal government treats people, in theory, of Minnesota and Louisiana the same. It's looking out for this big picture, big interests. So we need a federal law that will control water quality in all of our water bodies, including especially interstate rivers. Now, at the same time, so there's this upswell of interest in regulating waters. The states did not want to give up their authority over waters within their borders. So this is a reality of politics and regulation. You can want to protect the waters of the Mississippi as much as possible. And because we live in a democracy, other people will have other ideas about what should happen with it. And that's, in order to get the Clean Water Act passed, it had to have a power sharing kind of structure. They call it cooperative federalism. And the idea is that the federal government will regulate some parts of handle some parts of regulation of the river water, and the states will handle some parts. The federal government has the ultimate say, but the states get the first say in whatever the regulation is going to be. So if we can go to the next slide. So this is what the Clean Water Act looks like in its original form. And it was passed in 1970, enacted in 1972, and it was very optimistic. The goal was to control the discharge of pollutants into the water. By 1980s, the spoiler alert, that didn't happen exactly as planned, and to make all of the waters of the United States able to be suitable for fishing and swimming, and to protect the wildlife, shellfish and fish that live in and next to the river. So that's the goals of the river. Like I said, thought it would be done by the 80s. That was pretty much hopelessly optimistic. We're still working on it. So if you can go to the next slide. So I'll talk a little bit about cooperative federalism. One of the big ways that the Clean Water Act controls what goes into the river is by regulating literally point sources, which are pipes that are discharging, sending out some mix of water and pollutants directly into the river. And you can see why that was the most important thing that the drafters of this law were interested in. They were thinking about river fires and that sheen of chemicals on top of the river at the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland. That was the biggest problem at the time. Industrial sources pouring out their waste and wastewater into the river and it polluting the body of the river. So this is an easy thing to do. You regulate point sources. You control the water quality in the river by controlling what goes into it. And that's what they did. There is the law, the Clean Water Act, you can't discharge from a point source into the water of the US without a permit. So it sets up a permitting program. And for most of the states run the program, they issue the permits, they take care of all the permit application and most of permit enforcement. So if somebody violates the permit, that's something that the state will let them know about. And then EPA created limitations. They went industry by industry and pollutant by pollutant. And those are the limits that usually go into the permits that the state issues. So first of all, they looked at all the industrial chemicals, set limits on those, and then the states adopt them into the permits so that if you're an industrial discharger, you can't just discharge like you used to be able to before the act into the river. You're limited and you have to install technology that will limit what you're discharging to the amount that's written in the regulations. So EPA kind of sets floors, then the states run the program, and then EPA has ultimate control over the programs that the states run. They can veto permits, they have oversight to make sure that the states are doing it right, but it largely is run by the states. And the permit system is known as the National Pollution Discharge System, or NPDES or NPDES, depending who you're talking to. And it has been a success for what it set out to do. So industrial pollution from point sources has been drastically reduced since the 1970s, including on the Mississippi. So it's really not a problem as it used to be. The rivers don't catch on fire. Even the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland looks like a river, not like something that's inflammable. So as far as that goes, it's been great. But not perfect great, but still a couple of problems. So first of all, you have to recognize that something is a pollutant before you can regulate it. And there are pollutants sort of emerging today that people are like, oh yeah, maybe that shouldn't be in our water. The biggest example is what I call endocrine disruptors, which are the chemicals in birth control pills, for example. And they can interfere with the life cycle of creatures that live in and on the water. So permits right now don't really do anything to control those and keep that from going into the water. And it's in water, it comes from people, it comes from people disposing of medications, it comes, if they're making a medication, it goes to a point source. That wastewater is controlled, but any other way it gets in the water, not so much. So that's kind of a problem. New pollutants come up all the time. And as far as the Mississippi River is concerned, there are it runs through the middle of the nation's agricultural heartland, and there are a lot of exceptions in the Clean Water Act for farming activities. So if you're a farmer and you have a tile drain, and that tile drain drains your fields, brings it all to a point, and discharges it into a water, it looks very much like a point source, but it's not. The act makes a special exception for it. So that's another problem specifically for the Mississippi River, is that there's this big exemption for farming and agriculture, and that's where a lot of the new kinds of pollution come from. So we can go to the next slide. So the Clean Water Act is designed for point sources. Go into the water from a point. It's not really designed to handle agricultural pollution. Agricultural pollution washes into the water, usually across land. It doesn't come to a point. That's how you can remember it. So in the case of agricultural activities, excess fertilizer and dirt or sediment, when it rains, if it floods, wash into the rivers and pollute the rivers that way. And this is proven to be a much larger problem now that the industrial sources aren't the problem. If you can go to the next slide. So these are the top 10 pollutants regulated today. Pathogens are E. coli. I think everybody knows why that's a problem. People can't swim in the water or they'll get sick. But sediment, nutrients, and to an extent, organic enrichment, depleted oxygen. Really, the top 5 have a lot to do with this kind of pollution that washes in over land, and a lot of it comes from agriculture and agriculture in the Midwest. So what happens in the Midwest, and starting at the very top in Minneapolis, going all the way down as wherever there's farms, is excess fertilizer, and that includes animal waste used as fertilizer, and the dirt from the farm, to a lesser extent, the topsoil gets washed in with this too, washes into the river, flows downriver, and causes problems both at the bottom of the river and, to a lesser extent, and happening more and more up where we are in the river, further up the middle and the top of the river. So what's in fertilizer, it's called nutrients. It's nitrogen and phosphorus. And nutrients are good in small amounts, but the large amounts washing into the river are too much for the river to be able to handle. And when you have an excess of nutrients, algae starts to grow, and sometimes it can become toxic algae, in which it will harm people and animals. In other cases, what the algae does is it takes up all of the oxygen that's in the water, so that fish that use the water to breathe can't survive anymore. They either have to leave or they're going to end up dying due to lack of oxygen. So what's happened is that the water flows down the ear. It depends on the amount of flooding that you have, how much of it ends up in the Gulf of Mexico. But it ends up there, and there's a big dead zone, is what they call it, a hypoxic zone, where there's very low oxygen in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico. So you can go to the next slide. That's what the dead zone looks like. It's Louisiana at the top. They map it every year. They usually compare it to states. Like one year they'll say it's as big as Connecticut. Another year they'll say it's as big as Massachusetts. It's never been a really, really big state. It's usually a small state. But that is a zone in which no life can live. And it's devastated the shrimping industry in Louisiana, for example. So this is in some ways the kind of problem the Clean Water Act was enacted to solve. Minnesota doesn't have a big incentive to control non-point source pollution because it's in some ways Louisiana's problem. There's no hypoxic zone in Minnesota necessarily, the way there is this zone. So the federal government should take a large role in a role in solving the problem. But as a practical measure, it really hasn't. And again, this has to do with the way the law is set up, the way the cooperative federalism lets states decide what the quality of water in the water looks like. So the federal government set these base limits that go in the permits, but the states get to set the base limits of how much of a pollutant can actually be in the water. And this is when you come to another problem with the Clean Water Act. Back in 1972, everyone was thinking of industrial pollution coming through pipes. Nobody was really thinking about pollution that gets washed into the water over land. And there aren't really good provisions in the Clean Water Act for controlling that kind of pollution. So in other words, you can make a permit holder, if they are releasing too much of a pollutant into the water, you can make them reduce less by reducing the limits in their permit. And if they don't obey the permit, you can refuse to get them a permit, and they can be charged with even criminal offenses in some cases for violating the Clean Water Act or violating the terms of the permit, depending on what they're doing. For non-point sources, you really can't do that. So first of all, you have farmers. You can't really police water. It shouldn't pick on the farmers here. It's also anybody with a lawn. It all eventually flows off the lawn and into the river, and it's very hard to put a control at any one point and decide whose fault it is that anything is happening. So you couldn't put up a barrier the way you could with a pipe. You can easily turn on and off. Something washing into the river, not so much. And it's very hard to figure out by the time you get downstream exactly who is responsible for what. So even if you could have some way of doing something, it would be really hard to figure out. And then the Clean Water Act doesn't really have any way of enforcing limits against the kind of water that washes in from non-point sources. So that's led to a lot of problems. Nutrient pollution is a big problem. About 10 years ago, the National Academy of Sciences recommended that EPA kind of take over water quality in the Mississippi River. I was part of a group trying to get the government to do that. It would not do that. They really didn't want to do that. They're like, no, we think the states can handle it. 10 years out, states have not handled it, and it's been a really big problem. So this is kind of the quick story of the Clean Water Act as applied to the Mississippi. It's a story about laws and what they can and can't do. It's a story about problems. Your problems change over time. You solve one and another problem rears its head. And that people and politics are an inevitable part of how you control and how you protect the river. So I'm going to turn it over to Eric now. Thank you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. So I want to pick up with actually Elizabeth's opening remarks here about the wide range of laws that actually apply to rivers, and that in one way or another affect the condition of rivers and the ways people use it. An awful lot of just basic natural resources and property law is highly relevant to this subject. Water law is, drainage law, wildlife law, public and private nuisance, and a lot more. With respect to wildlife law, for instance, as many people know, all wildlife is owned by the people collectively. It doesn't belong to landowners. It's owned by the people collectively, managed by the state with certain trustee duties to take care of the wildlife for the benefit of all people. That wildlife trust notion hasn't really had much teeth put into it yet, but it could. I mean, what if states took seriously their obligation to protect wildlife and to protect its habitat? If it did that, our rivers might look a lot different. I think for people who are concerned about rivers, there's been a mounting frustration, in part for the reasons that Elizabeth points out. I mean, here in Illinois, that the polluted runoff from agriculture that she mentions is far and away our number one source of water pollution. In fact, some years ago, the Illinois EPA estimated that by quantity, something like 75 to 80% of all water pollution comes from agriculture. And although efforts have been set up to deal with it, there's been almost no progress. I think the frustration people had has led many people to want to look for some simple fix, some way for rivers to be taken more seriously to protect the life in them. And it's hardly surprising that in that context, people often raise this question about, well, what if rivers as such had rights? What if we recognize rights and tried to protect those rights? Wouldn't that be sort of an end run around a lot of the limits on the detailed regulatory regimes that Elizabeth refers to? This is, of course, a very American thing to do, to frame our basic moral and cultural clashes in terms of individual rights. So, what if rivers had rights? Wouldn't the fight here be a little more equal? I see quite a bit of benefit in probing this line of reasoning, because I think when we do so, we encounter some fundamental questions about humans and nature, questions that too often just get skipped over in the rush to want to grapple with the details. If a river had rights of some sort, what would they be? Some version of a right to life, we assume, or some right to physical and biological integrity. But what would that look like? And how would it translate into decisions about water uses, water withdrawals, discharges, levee building, and so on? Rivers, of course, are dynamic natural systems. They change on their own over time, not just meandering. People in Missouri know a lot about meandering, but there's variations in water flows and aquatic life, in the ways that rivers interact with their floodplains. So that when we talk about conserving a river, there's really no fixed target that we can aim at. We can't say, all right, this is what the river ought to look like. Let's try to get there. When humans use rivers, they inevitably change them. This is true of nature generally. We can't use nature without changing it. We can't use land in the catchment basin or watershed of a river without changing the rivers themselves, since the rivers are connected to everything that happens within the drainage area. It's entirely appropriate, of course, for us to be using nature, which means inevitably to be changing it. But we shouldn't be misusing nature. We shouldn't be abusing it. Indeed, the definition I like of an environmental problem is this. It is some human activity, some human interaction with nature that we deem to be harmful or bad or unwise in some respect. It's some abuse of nature. Well, that kind of definition, though, of course, isn't very helpful unless we can find some way to draw the line between the use of nature and the abuse of it. We need to recognize first that this isn't just a scientific question. We can't just draw in scientists and say, well, you tell us, because it really involves basic questions of right and wrong, wise and foolish, prudent and imprudent. I mean, these are what we call normative questions that go well beyond science, although, of course, science is extremely important in our efforts to try to translate our moral hopes into on-the-ground decisions. We need to realize, of course, that uses of rivers by one person affect other people. They affect future generations. They affect other life forms. We need to note also that the interests of various species themselves often conflict. We in the United States and worldwide have been suffering through a long, continuing, relatively rapid decline in just animal populations generally. Wildlife populations continue to slide down. But even as that happens, there's individual species that are thriving. And so the Mississippi River today is probably wonderfully improved in terms of habitat for a select few species. I think that we need to link this issue here of what's good for rivers. What would the content of their rights, what would they be if we recognize rights? We need to link that to the question of who gets to decide these issues. Who gets to set the standard for the rights of rivers, and then who gets to stand up and argue for it in court. It hardly needs saying that different people here will make widely different choices. So there's a selection of a river advocate can have great consequences to it. Even if we were to get over these two obstacles, that is identifying what is good for rivers, and then identifying the good people who are going to stand up for the rivers, we then need to translate these lofty visions into real world decisions, since there are, of course, competing concerns. In the world of rights talk generally, the rights on one side inevitably clash with claims of rights on the other side. So it isn't enough just to articulate the right. We have to figure out how it's going to fare in competition with other rights. Well, when we do that, of course, things get messy pretty quickly. The day-to-day decision making about water withdrawals, pollution discharges, dams and levees, dredging and channelization, drainage practices throughout the watershed, land use, land cover change throughout the watershed, and more. I mean, all of these are relevant when we start talking about the condition of rivers and what kind of changes in human behavior are going to be needed. So this brings me then to a major concern that many lawyers and nearly all courts would have with this idea of vesting rivers with rights. Who is supposed to supply the details here? Who is supposed to sort of flesh out broad principles into a legal regime? Well, legislatures might do it. Regulatory agencies could get involved, of course, but matters could well then be left to courts. And the courts here are mighty nervous to take on such things. Courts are happiest when they've got clear rules of law to apply to the facts. They get very nervous when they're only given very broad general standards and have to develop a body of law themselves. I mean, a good analogy here might be to those provisions of state constitutions that guarantee for individuals a right to a healthful environment. Illinois has one. It takes up an entire article, Article 11 of our Constitution. You look at that article, we've got a right to a healthful environment, and you think, oh, this is a game changer. This really changes the discussion about our uses of nature. But in fact, courts have pretty much ignored it. They have thrown up their hands and said, we can't really apply this. We're just going to leave it to the legislature to figure out what it means and to take steps to implement it. I mean, I guess I need to say that although I can see the allure of this rights rhetoric for rivers, I'm not a real supporter of rights for rivers. I don't think that they involve any quick fix. We're still left with these messy decisions and choices and trade-off. There's a further concern here, I think, with this rights rhetoric, because in some ways it sends the wrong message. When we talk about the rights of rivers, we're imagining rivers on one side and what then sort of people on the other. Rivers have rights, people have rights, and let's sort of try to thrash them out. The underlying message here is that conservation is about protecting nature from people. It's all about nature, and inevitably it's going to harm people. And I think this has been a problem for the environmental movement, for the conservation effort for many years. The claim that they're just protecting nature from people. It also needs to be said that rights rhetoric itself is quite highly divisive. And it accounts, I think, for a lot of the cultural and political fragmentation of our era. But I won't sort of head down that line, leave that for another day. I want to stick with rivers. But it is true that people certainly are the problem when it comes to degradation of our rivers. They are declining due to human activities, and we humans need to change our ways in many respects. So it does mean, if we're going to protect rivers, to alter how people behave, not limiting their options. But I think a better way to frame our predicament is to begin from a rather different place. To begin with this understanding that a river really is a complex community of life. And that those people who live near the rivers, who use it, who live anywhere in the catchment basin are part of this community. And it's a community that's highly interdependent and interconnected. This community as such, if we think about it that way, a land community, it would be called, including waters and rivers, the land community can be more or less healthy in terms of the way it functions, which is linked to its biological diversity. Healthy rivers are good for pretty much everything that exists within that community of life, including humans. Healthy rivers will benefit us in the long run. I like this image because it gets us away from the notion that conservation is about favoring nature over people. When we put people into nature and think about the single community, then it's about promoting the welfare of this community as a whole, a community that includes people as well as other life forms and future generations and so on. So I think rather than put forward a vision of rivers with rights, I would be inclined instead to put forward the vision of this community of life, the river community, including people that can be more or less healthy. You know, we're all in this together. What we do today is linked to the past and is linked to the future. If we're going to pursue this notion of a healthy river, use it as a guiding light of some sort. Of course, we then need indicators of human river health, measures of it. You know, but it's a complex matter, but it can be done. You know, how often on the news do we hear indicators about the health of our economy? What if with the same frequency, we got regular reports about the health of our river communities? And if we similarly cheered when the numbers went up. So this is the language that I prefer, this language of community, of the common good. And I think it would be helpful if all of our talk about rivers and uses, of our conflicts over them, if we put to one side all questions of rights and instead focus much more upon the welfare of the community. This rhetoric I'm talking about here, of course, clashes with a lot of American culture and with many institutions. That are based upon culture and implement private property in particular. I'll have to leave that issue for another day, but I think one of the challenges that we have, one of the ways forward is for us to start thinking seriously about private property and to realize that the form of private property that we have is not the only one that is possible. It's not the only one that we have had. It's a very flexible institution. And I think in many ways we can elevate the standards of what we expect from landowners, saying to them that they have to engage in uses of the land that are consistent with the long-term lasting health of this land community. So that's sort of the main message that I want to give here, is that I think if we're going to move forward with the welfare of our rivers, we need to think of them as biological communities, interdependent, interconnected communities of life that include people. And we need to talk about the health of that community. And we need to ask ourselves, what steps can we take today to try to promote that health? So let me end there, and it's time for questions, or past time for questions.
Well, thank you, Eric. Thank you, Elizabeth. We really appreciate both of you being here to share your knowledge and your wealth of experience. I am not yet seeing questions in the Q&A. Oh, here's one. So the question is, there are quite a few successful legal actions on rights of nature and rights of rivers cases over the past 10 years, including at least 4 in the US. Isn't precedent a strong argument to support a rights of rivers nature case? It certainly is a strong basis for legislative action. Do either of you have thoughts on that?
I sure do. Yes, it certainly is a basis for legislative action, but I think we need to realize that if that's what happens, the driving force here isn't really legal rights as such. It's an underlying moral claim that we really need to respect our rivers more than we do. It really is. It's a more of a cultural or rhetorical claim, and I think there's a lot of merit to that. To using the rights rhetoric in that way. But I think we need to not kid ourselves that rights rhetoric is inherently divisive. And although it can be beneficial, some people will like it. Other people, it's gonna rub them the wrong way. It's gonna say, well, yes, rivers may have rights, but what about my right to liberty? What about my right to property? They're trampling my rights. So I'm a little bit worried about that. I will also say that the successful legal claims that are out there haven't really resulted in much in the way of river improvement. So you might almost say we need to hold off and see whether those jurisdictions, and many of them outside the United States, I mean, those are better examples, those jurisdictions that are using rights rhetoric, we need to sort of watch over time and say, does this practice really lead to improvement for rivers? There are some examples where it has, but they typically are where legislatures have set up advocates for rivers, given them funding, given them a specific charge, and given them a role in government decision making generally. And if that were to happen, surely our rivers could improve.
Okay. Our next question is, let's see here. What other forms of property holding do you feel is consistent with the community of nature?
Ah, that's
So
wonderful.
you can definitely take that one.
Yeah, so I will say I've written a lot about private property for decades, several books out there, and I am sometimes accused of disliking private property, and I always deny that vehemently. I'm a big fan of private property. Um, I would just point out, though, that property can come in many different shapes and sizes in terms of what can be owned and what it means to own and the various rights and responsibilities of ownership. So what I'm talking about really is altering that mix. But this is a mix that has changed significantly over time and over the generations. I think most Americans would be stunned if they heard really what it meant to own land 200 years ago in this country. It was a widespread rule throughout much of the country that landowners, for instance, had no right to exclude people from coming on their lands. Generally, there was no general right to exclude. People could come onto your lands, they could hunt, they could forage, they could drive their livestock on there, including hogs, which did a lot of damage. The only way you could exclude them is by going to the very considerable expense of fencing your land. Physically enclosed spaces, you could keep people off of your land. Well, now that's not the rule today. It wouldn't be a sensible rule today, but I offer it only as an illustration of how the rules of property ownership have shifted. Anyway, my short answer here would be that I think there's a number of basic rules of property law, private nuisance, public nuisance, water law, drainage law, and the like, that could be tweaked so that we expect our landowners to engage in practices that are more consistent with the ecological health and biological diversity of the landscapes that they help form. I could say vastly more about it, but it wouldn't be an unrecognizable form of property, but it really would be one where we expect more of landowners. We expect them to be good community members, and in this case, we're talking about members of the land community itself.
Thank you. Elizabeth, a question for you. What are some regional examples of model private property use that respect common use and value for our rivers?
Yeah, I think that's still one for Eric.
Okay.
That's the, I will just say this to add to what Eric has said. As someone who goes to court and brings cases, it is incredibly divisive. Litigation is not a good way to handle problems. It is people asserting rights is why we have the laws that we have. That's why there's an exception for farmers in the Clean Water Act, for example. It's the idea of personal, you're not going to tell me what I can do with my property. And I'm not sure that adding rivers as yet another party into that mix would be the greatest idea, especially if you want to turn things down and come up with something constructive about how to actually manage the river in a way that benefits the river and the people who live by it.
I can add to that. There are, I mean, Elizabeth was right in really shining a pretty bright light on agricultural runoff. Here in the Midwest, it is our #1 water pollution problem. But there are a lot of best management practices that have been developed for farmers that can cut dramatically the polluted runoff in terms of their fertilizer use, their pesticide use, putting cover crops in over the winter and so on, leaving wider buffer strips. there's a lot of best management practices, and they could be turned into regulations. They have to a modest extent in some states. I mean, and so they offer a ready approach to take. And so these would just be putting restrictions on land use in rural areas that frankly would be a lot less restrictive than those that are commonly imposed in urban and suburban areas. I mean, people in the rural areas just aren't used to this, but people in urban and suburban areas are very familiar with significant restrictions on how they can use it. So it's all part of our American property system. And it's anyway, there's a lot of measures that have been developed. If we just had the political will to move on it.
Okay. I think this might really be a question for Elizabeth. The hypoxia in the Gulf Stream impacts the biosphere. How can we make visible the harm for those who live upstream?
That has been a project of environmentalists working with the river for years and years. And as somebody who goes out and talks to people, who goes to court, it's hard to get people in a faraway place to care about something that's happening somewhere else. And I don't know that there's like a magic way to do that. People care about what happens to them. And as nutrient pollution increases, for example, people upstream are starting to have more problems. They're starting to see algae. They're starting to see cyanotoxins coming into their waters. And that's what makes them consider, oh, that's what's been going on in the Gulf for all of these years. Oh, that's really awful. We should probably do something about it. But it's been hard to just get regular people who are just doing what they, doing their business. They've got other things on their mind to care about something that happens that far away. Shrimp also aren't like the world's most magnetic animals to argue about, and fish. You need cute pandas or something to really get people excited, but it's really been difficult. And I don't know that anybody's been terrifically successful at making it happen.
Yeah, I can add a little bit to that. There is a real denial about problems. I think people whose livelihood generates these problems are often very reluctant to recognize them, not just when the ill effects are far away, but even when they're near. Here in Illinois, the conservation group I work with, Prairie Rivers Network, has been pushing for years to get more attention to nitrates in the drinking water wells of rural people themselves. That is, in the farming communities, the nitrogen going on the soil leaks into their drinking water, and it's affecting them. But there is just widespread opposition to anything like mandatory testing of wells, because if you start testing the wells, they'll turn up the problem. If the problem is revealed, somebody might want to do something about it. And so the best solution to avoid regulation is just not to investigate, not to engage in the basic scientific research. And so, they sort of, I hate to use the term anti-environmentalism because that puts a negative spin on it, but those people who are strongly in favor of industrial agriculture as it's now practiced have for many years had a campaign to just squash scientific research, that basic data gathering. It's very hard to get, Illinois does almost no water sampling on its rivers. We have to rely upon the Geological Survey, and it's all just political pressure from agriculture.
Thank you. So just one last question from our audience. How can we assure good laws or regulations don't get overturned and instead stick around for future sensible land use when there are so many jurisdictions? And this person gives a couple examples that the Maryland Heights development plans were recently set aside, and some pretty good floodplain development limits were put in place in Jefferson County.
So that's, in both of those cases, citizen activism had a lot to do with it. I can say definitely for Maryland Heights, and if I'm thinking about the floodplain regulations, this is something where people saw a problem and just kept at their government until they found the right person to be able to make the case and get something done that they wanted to get done. And it doesn't happen without that a lot of times. Rivers don't vote, so they don't have representatives, and it really is up to people to make things like that happen. Floodplain management is a whole other set of laws besides the Clean Water Act, but yeah, very important. And convincing the people who have the power to do something about it and keeping at them until they do, and voting in people who are willing to listen to you and willing to make those things happen is probably the best way to get any action going forward.
Okay. Well, with that, I will just say thank you both. We really appreciate you, Elizabeth and Eric, for joining us today for this dialogue. And audience, thank you for joining us in this virtual space. We, of course, would love for you to join us next time. There are 2 to 3 STL History Live virtual programs each week. The next few are up on the screen. I also shared in the chat a link to our membership website, as well as link to sign up for e-newsletters if you'd like to hear more about these STL History Live programs and some other things we have going on at Missouri Historical Society. I also mentioned that there is that survey that should have popped up in another browser tab for you. Again, if you have a few moments to just fill it out for us, we would really appreciate it. And with that, I again just will thank everyone involved today, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thank
Have
you.
a great
Thank
rest of
you.
your week.
Thanks.
Thank you.